Good.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the panel Populism, Policy, and Pluralism, and Profiles at the National and State Level at the annual meeting of the New York State Political Science Association. My name is Ashley Bozian. I'll be moderating this panel. A little bit about me for introductions. I'm a PhD candidate in the history department at St. John's University in New York City. My dissertation, which is currently in progress, is titled Gender, Sex, and the Body in Early Medieval Armenia. So as you can tell from that, just a little bit of information right there, I quite obviously don't really fit in here. But I want to thank my dear friend, Dr. Chris Cody, for inviting me to be a part of this panel and this conference. It's not something that I would otherwise have the opportunity to participate in. And I think one of the really valuable aspects of working in such an academically diverse department as ours at St. John's is that we get to engage in these interdisciplinary, intermethodological conferences and conversations, and we really get to learn new information and ideas from each other. So things that I wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity to engage with. So it's really a great opportunity for me. I'm very grateful. And I always enjoy getting the chance to learn about these other interests and disciplines. So this will be a really wonderful experience for me and for all of us, I hope. I have only a very rudimentary understanding of the topics of your papers. So while I was admittedly nervous to host this panel for that very reason, I'm also really hopeful that my essentially outsider's perspective will contribute positively and allow us to bring these papers into context together in a way that's fruitful for all of us, myself included. And I have had the opportunity to read all of your papers, and I can say confidently, we have a panel of just absolutely wonderful scholarship to discuss here. It's really been quite a joy and a privilege for me to learn so much from all of your research, and I'm hopeful that our conversation today will prove productive for everyone. So without anything further, I will introduce our first paper, which comes from Professor Michael Boston, who is an associate professor at the college at Brockport. His paper is titled Arthur O. Eve and George K. Arthur, Two New York State Grassroots Politicians. Professor Boston, whenever you're ready.
Professor Boston, you are muted, so I am going to, something should pop up that asks you to unmute.
Okay.
Excellent.
All right. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Let's see. Okay, my presentation, as was mentioned, is on Arthur O. Eve and George K. Arthur, two grassroots politicians who work generally for everybody in New York State or Buffalo, but they were particularly concerned with what I call the least of the. Here's a picture of this was a group of people that participated in a march in 1968 to try to diffuse the aftermath when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. So they were marching for peace. If you look to the right, the man with the hat on is Arthur O. Eve, and the gentleman talking to him is George K. Arthur. So around this time, they're budding politicians, and they're making themselves known to the city of Buffalo and citizens in general within the city of Buffalo. So if we look at Arthur O. Eve, he was born in 1933. His parents were immigrants from the Dominican Republic. He was, they came to Miami, and eventually they went to New York City. And then from New York City, he came to Buffalo, New York as a young person. George K. Arthur was also born in 1933. And he resided as a child in the Fifth Ward. And the Fifth Ward was sort of like where the downtown area is in Buffalo, New York, if anybody's familiar with it, where the downtown library is. So he was born in that area, delivered by supposedly a midwife who was busy, but since she was busy, his grandmother's the one that aided in birthing him. In terms of leadership, both of these individuals, from people in the Buffalo community in New York State have said that they had a natural propensity for leadership. Now, when Arthur O. Eve came to Buffalo, he he had, both of these individuals had participated in the military. Arthur O. Eve was in the Army after the Korean War from 1953 to 1955. So when he came to Buffalo, he originally worked for a Chevrolet plant, and then ultimately he was interested in playground recreational activities, and he saw some of the children, the youth, and he noticed that a number of them had not had guidance, and he wanted to play a role in their lives by having a job working with children. But he was told in order to get one of these recreational jobs, he had to be connected to a political party. So he got connected to the Democratic Party. The people in the party saw his leadership potential. They gave him this job, and he worked his way up from a grassroots level type of position. He was influential with these children, and he ultimately worked within the community. But ultimately, in 1966, he ran for state government and got a position in the New York State Assembly, which he was there from 1966 to 2002. He worked his way up in the Assembly, becoming the Deputy Speaker, head of the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus. So he was a very influential individual in New York State government. Now, George K. Arthur, similarly, he was also in the military. In the early 1960s, a friend of his wanted him to run for a local Democratic committee position. He did that, and he and his friend, they both got this Democratic position on the Democratic committee within the Fifth Ward. From there, 1964, George K. Arthur was elected to the Erie County Board of Supervisors, and he stayed in that position for 3 years. As I said earlier, he had a propensity for politics, and he would work his way up within city government. In 1970, he would run for Buffalo Common Council, and he would stay in that position for up until about 1977, and then he would run for an at-large position. And then from there, from 1984 to 1996, he was elected president of the Buffalo Common Council. So you have George K. Arthur once again working on the local level in terms of politics in Buffalo, whereas Arthur O. Eve, he worked on the state level, but he's very much connected to the city of Buffalo. Now, how else did these individuals endear the people of Buffalo in particular, and then for Arthur O. Eve, New York State? Well, as I mentioned earlier, in 1967, when both of these individuals were becoming known, they tried to defuse the riots. There was a riot in Buffalo in 1967, and there was also a riot in other parts of the country, Detroit and Newark, New Jersey. And Dr. Martin Luther King actually came to Buffalo to help to try to defuse the riot, the one in 1967. The one in 1968 happened as a result of Dr. Martin Luther King being assassinated. And when he was assassinated, there was something like 125 riots that took place throughout the country. But anyway, Arthur O. Eve worked rigorously to defuse this riot, endearing himself to people in the community, as leaders within the Buffalo area, as well as New York State, because Rockefeller was supportive of Arthur O. Eve helping to defuse these riots. Now, one thing about Arthur O. Eve, as I mentioned earlier, he had a soft spot for children. He saw a lot of children not having proper role models, perhaps a father in the household, and he wanted to play a role in their lives. And as a political figure, he felt it was very important that he be visible in the communities and let people actually see what he was trying to do to help the community. And in that way, this is how he really was gained respect in the community, and people trusted him and felt that he was a valid politician, not just coming around to get their votes around election time. Now, here's a picture right here. It was taken in 1967. You can see Dr. Martin Luther King is in the middle. In the back, the person next to the woman in the back to the left, that's George K. Arthur. And the individual to the right of Dr. King that's taller than him, that's Arthur O. Eve as a young person. Now, another thing that Arthur O. Eve did to really endear himself to a segment, at least of the African American community, was when the Attica uprising occurred in around 1970, 1971. He was one of the first politicians, or the very politician that actually went into the prison to talk to the to inmates, and they had a feeling that he was sincere, and they trusted him to be a negotiator in that process, in that impasse. So Arthur O. Eve, Clarence Jones, Huey P. Newton, and a number of other people, Blanevia Bonds, who's a woman that was a leader in Niagara Falls. These are some of the persons that were called in to help to try to diffuse that situation. Now, as a result of the aftermath of the Attica uprising, Arthur O. Eve introduced in state government some prison reform legislation. So once again, this activity of him networking with some of the people that were considered the lowest of the lowest in prison, who he was trying to help and trying to reform, he endeared. That's another way in which he endeared himself to some of the least of the in New York State. One of the most critical things that Arthur O. Eve was involved in was he helped to get monies within the state to be used to create educational opportunities for poor people and people that were deficient in their educational backgrounds, or underprivileged individuals. So in other words, what he did was he set up a class-based system to really help the lower class individuals to get an opportunity to get college educations or university educations. And that started around 66, 67. And to my knowledge, that program is still effective in colleges and universities, SEEK programs or ELP programs. So that's another way in which he endeared himself to children or younger people. Now, another thing that he did, which he's proud of, he did a lot of things, and in actuality, perhaps I should have limited this to one of these individuals because they both did a lot, particularly Arthur O. Eve. But in the early, I should say, during the 1960s, 66, 67, 68, and after, he tried to work to ensure that New York State provided some slots for minority contractors to get New York State's funds to work on construction projects, and also for minorities to be hired for projects that New York State was going to be funding. So he did a lot of things once again, but these are some of the things that stand out when people think about Arthur O. Eve. Now, in terms of George K. Arthur, similarly, he did some of the same things to endear himself to the Buffalo community. During the riots, when he was coming up as a young person, he tried to help diffuse the negative activities that were occurring in the local community, in Buffalo as well as Niagara Falls, New York, because Niagara Falls, New York also had a riot. And one of George K. Arthur's credos was he really believed, they both did, that he had to be visible in the communities to respond to people's their desires, you know, what they felt the community needed to be inclusive and to be progressive, and just to have the ear of their political figures. So he really was a very visible person in the community. And a lot of the people in the Buffalo community really speak to the effect that George K. Arthur was always a visible person within the Buffalo community, African American community, and also the broader community. Now, one of the things that George K. Arthur is really noted for is his push for equality in education. And when you think about the desegregations of the public schools in Buffalo following the mandate of education in New York State that the schools be integrated. Well, George K. Arthur is one of the persons that really pushed that in Buffalo. There were a lot of people, not just him, but in terms of the lawsuit, he was the plaintiff in the case against the public school system to integrate the schools in Arthur versus Nyquist. And that was a successful venture. George K. Arthur's and others won that case, and that really pushed forth the effort to desegregate the schools in Buffalo, New York. And that's one of the things I think that he's very proud of. Now, George K. Arthur also, because he was so visible, and once again, Arthur O. Eve was visible too, but George K. Arthur worked on the local level. He mentored a lot of people that were involved in the political arena. And one of the persons that he mentored was James Pitt. And if anybody knows about the political history of the Buffalo Common Council, James Pitt was very effective, probably in the 80s up into the 90s in the Buffalo Common Council. And he talks about as a youngster that it was George K. Arthur that had a great influence on him, and that George K. Arthur was always at community gatherings and meetings. Now, the current mayor of Buffalo, New York, Byron Brown, also talks about how he was mentored by George K. Arthur. I mean, as a college student at Buff State College, he did an internship in George K. Arthur's office. And he's very respectful for that and says that he learned a lot. And Darius Pridgett, now who's currently in the Buffalo Common Council, also pays homage to George K. Arthur. Now, both politicians, grassroots politicians, they once again networked in the community. And two of their places of networking so that their constituents and other people in the community could see them were these two restaurants. Gigi's restaurant was on Ferry Street. That was a major restaurant within the African American community. So anybody that wanted to work with Arthur O. Eve or George K. Arthur, these are Maddie's Restaurant. These are places that people would come to. Politicians would come there, have lunch with Arthur O. Eve, or they would, or people in Buffalo, other politicians would come to these restaurants and have lunch. And this was a way of networking and also letting the community see that these politicians were visible. If they had any concerns, they could approach them in those restaurants. Okay. They also had another commonality. In 1977, Arthur O. Eve ran for the mayorship of Buffalo, New York. He almost won, but he did win the Democratic primary, but he lost to Jimmy Griffin. And then also in 1985, George K. Arthur also ran for the mayoral position. He also lost to Jimmy Griffin. That was a close election, but once again, this shows you or gives you a hint of these two men. New York State in Buffalo, and George K. Arthur in Buffalo. George K. Arthur recently passed away. December 25th, 2020. His political papers are housed at Buff State College. A historian by the name of Monroe Fordham is the one that filmed his papers, had a staff to film his papers, so those are available for researchers. And Arthur O. Eve's papers are currently at the University of Buffalo. From my research, there is a book that's been written on Arthur O. Eve. It's titled Give the Brothers and Sisters Some Role in the Struggle by Elizabeth Levy and Maria Miller. But I think both of these individuals are still worthy of more research, more papers written on them. And I think in the future, something will be done. And here's pictures of these individuals: Arthur O. Eve to the left as an older person, and George K. Arthur. I think this was done to George K. Arthur. I know it's not really too clear. It was done in about 2017 or 18. And like I said, he passed away recently in 2020. So basically, once again, summing this up, these were two local politicians that worked for everybody, but they had a particular interest in what they categorized as the least of the middle class, but particularly those in the lower class that did not have, what they perceive as did not have a lot of opportunities. So stop right here. Okay, so that's generally what I have to say.
Okay, now I'm not muted anymore. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you, Professor Boston. That was a wonderful paper. I already have so many questions that I'll save for the end. Thank you so much. Our next paper is by Professor Harvey Strum. Professor Strum is Professor of History and Political Science at Russell Sage College. He's a former annual conference program chair and president of the Northeastern Political Science Association, and a 2020 to 21 Sherman David Specter Fellow in the Humanities at Sage. For the past 20 years, he has been the section chair for international relations at the New York State Political Science Association. Professor Strum, here we have your paper, Foreign Policy's Impact on Local and State Politics in New York, 1807 to 1815. Whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you. Besides the regular party committees, Republicans use Tammany Hall, Irish ethnic organizations, and mechanic societies, adjunct party organizations. Federalists countered by establishing between 1809 and 1815 Washington Benevolent, Washington School, and Whig societies. Federalists created a network of politically active societies throughout the state, but the evidence does not prove that party organization alone led to electoral success. Intensified Federalist organizing activities reflected the resurgence of federalism produced by the embargo of 1807 to 1809. The embargo, and not party organization as such, provided the catalyst for the temporary Federalist resurrection. The foreign policy of President Thomas Jefferson temporarily reshaped politics in New York. President James Madison's foreign policies, especially the War of 1812, gave new life to federalism in New York. Republicans considered themselves as a part of a national movement led by Thomas Jefferson. However, they used their ties to the national Republican movement to suit their own local political interests. They avowed loyalty to Jefferson and Madison, or condemned Virginia domination to strengthen their own position in New York State. By refusing to use the power of federal patronage to mediate internal Republican political rivalries, of which there were many in New York State, President Jefferson forfeited the possibility of turning New York Republicans into loyal Jeffersonians. Not until DeWitt Clinton openly challenged Madison's reelection in 1812 did President Madison use federal patronage to weaken the power of the Clintonians. Only after the outbreak of the war and Madison's reelection did the majority of New York's Republicans consider themselves Madisonians and expel DeWitt Clinton from the Republican embrace for the duration of the war. Between 1806 and 1815, foreign policy and domestic national issues were superimposed upon existing political divisions in New York. Foreign policy and national issues reinforced some existing political divisions, Federalists versus Republicans, and altered others, the factional divisions within the Republican Party. After 1800, most New Yorkers identified with the principles of the Republican Party: republicanism with a small r, equalitarianism, nationalism, and Anglophobia. Voters accepted the Republican Party's images of the Federalists as aristocrats, elitists, Anglophiles, and Tories. Federalist gains in the Assembly elections in 1808 and 09, in 1812 and 1813 and 1815, the Senate elections of 1809, the congressional elections of 1808 and 1812, and the gubernatorial election of 1813 represented a repudiation of the embargo and war of 1812, of the foreign policies of Jefferson and Madison, not a repudiation of the Republican Party. Between 1808 and 1815, foreign policy and its impact on the lives of New Yorkers served as the major campaign issue in town, city, assembly, senatorial, congressional, and gubernatorial elections. Republican victories in 1810 and 11 and 1814 depended on the removal of the embargo and upon a change in public attitudes towards the war produced by the British invasion of New York and the destruction along the Niagara frontier. We just heard about Buffalo. That's what got destroyed. Daniel Tompkins was much more narrowly won election in 1813 as governor due to the assistance of the Madison administration and the propitious purchases of provisions in Western New York that resulted in boosting the price of grain by 16%. These victories and the return of Republican dominance in 1816 suggested that Federalist gains depended on foreign policy issues and were only temporary and only interrupt Republican dominance during the time period I've mentioned. Also, voting behavior and election rhetoric reflected a change in attitude towards deference. For example, in 1814, Philip Van Cortlandt and Valentine Morris ran for Congress, but voters rejected men from well-born and well-known families for obscure political hacks who championed the common man and Republican Party positions. The inability of men like William North, Judge William Cooper, and Jacob Morris to control voting behavior of the majority of lower and middle class voters in Schenectady and Otsego counties revealed the decline of Federalists and with the deference in New York politics. Let me just quote this. At a meeting of 160 farmers and mechanics in Duanesburg, by the way, is in western Schenectady County, we don't know where it is. In March 1810, Republicans cautioned the voters, let us not elect men whose aristocratic doctrine teaches the rights and representative authority of people are vested in a few proud nobles. Farmers and mechanics should elect men of their own kind, Republicans asked. Does a nobleman know the want of a farmer or mechanic? If we give such men the management of our concerns, where is our independence and freedom? And essentially, this reflected the decline of deference in New York State politics, which was occurring during this time period. Between 1808 and 1815, the effects of foreign policy threatened Republican dominance. Republican Party support for the embargo and the war alienated many Republican voters, even in the western counties, which were essentially an area of major support for the Republican Party in New York State. Trying to prevent the defection of Republican voters to the Federalists, the Clintonian faction of the Republican Party initially opposed the embargo and the War of 1812. Endorsing the embargo and the war, opponents of the Clintons within the Republican Party hoped to convince rank and file Republicans that they, not the Clintons, meaning George Clinton and DeWitt Clinton, should lead the state party. George Clinton was a very popular New York politician. He got elected governor 7 times between 1777 and 1795 and 1801 to 1804. He became vice president in 1804 and died in office in 1812, the first vice president to die in office. Because of his popularity, Clinton dominated New York state politics for decades. His nephew, DeWitt Clinton, served as an assemblyman, a state senator, lieutenant governor, and for almost 10 years as mayor of New York City. And of course, later, after the War of 1812, he got elected governor of New York. Clinton challenged Madison for the presidency in 1812. Opponents within the Republican Party saw DeWitt Clinton's challenge to Madison and the death of George Clinton as an opportunity during the War of 1812 to gain political power at the expense of the Clintonians. Although all shared the same Republican values, especially Anglophobia. For the duration of the war, Tammany members united in support of the war, and Madison reduced the power of the Clintonian faction. A number of Clinton's previous allies, Governor Daniel Tompkins, and of course, future President Martin Van Buren of Kinderhook, abandoned DeWitt Clinton to show support for Madison in the war. Between 1806 and 1815, Anglophobia formed the core of the Republican Party ideology in New York. Republicans stirred up anti-British feelings after the killing of American seamen in New York Harbor in the Leander Affair of April 1806, and making it a political issue in New York City. A year later, the killing of several Americans off the Virginia Capes aboard the Chesapeake became a major political issue in New York State in the summer of 1807. For a brief period in early July, Federalists and Republicans joined together to voice their outrage at British actions before the Republicans renewed their attack on the Federalists as pro-British Tories. In 1808, leaders of the Tammany Martling men because they drank at a Martling's Tavern in New York. That became their headquarters, so they became known as the Martling men. And used Anglophobia to promote the public image of the Martling men by marching the remains of Revolutionary War dead through the city for reburial in Brooklyn. All Republican factions played on New York fears and hatred of the British, a legacy of the fact that the British occupied New York throughout the Revolution. Tammany, in particular, owed its rapid growth from 1806 to 1815 on its successful exploitation of public hostility to England. Not surprisingly, New York Republicans described the War of 1812 as a second struggle in defense of violated rights. The War of 1812 demonstrated to the Republicans the viability of republicanism with a small r. Salisbury Republicans toasted to the late war a practical refutation that Republican governments only calculated for a state of peace. Rejecting the Federalist claim that the Republican Party fought the war for conquest, Samuel Berrien described the war as neither a war of ambition nor of conquest, but a struggle for our rights, our commercial prosperity, our national honor. If any man seriously indulged the idea of attaching Canada to the United States, declared New York editor Charles Holt, it cannot be more ridiculous than the notion of recolonizing the United States. While the War of 1812 stood as a minor sideshow to the Napoleonic Wars, New York Republicans imparted cosmic significance to the Anglo-American struggle. Ours was a righteous cause. It was the common cause of mankind, bragged Samuel Berrien on the 4th of July, 1815. After all, the liberty of the world, he added, had taken refuge under our banner. Even before the French gave Americans the Lady of Liberty in New York Harbor, New York Republicans believed the United States represented the best hope for mankind, the last refuge of liberty in a world of despotism. New York supporters of the war did not urge an appeal to arms for Canada, but feared Native Americans, a legacy of the Tory Native American raids in the Mohawk Valley during the Revolution. And Americans, actually, the fear of Native American produced panic in Western New York and in the northern frontier before and just after the start of the war, especially in St. Lawrence, Jefferson, and Franklin counties in the northern part of the state. Western, and again, this did not, economic conditions produced the embargo of 1807 and 1809 and drove Western and Northern New Yorkers to vote Federalist. Settlers in mass violated the embargo, non-intercourse, and laws against trading with the enemy. During the embargo, this issue had got so bad that President Jefferson declared the Lake Champlain region of New York in a state of insurrection. Jefferson wanted to declare the region from Buffalo to Watertown in a state of insurrection, but Governor Daniel Tompkins, fearing the political blowback, persuaded Jefferson to relent. From prominent Republicans like Jacob Potash Brown, engaged in smuggling. During the War of 1812, 2/3 of the provisions that fed British troops in Canada came from New York and Vermont. Profit and economic survival proved more persuasive than patriotism during the war for many Republicans as well as Federalists. Let me mention something else that is happening. Both the Republicans and Federalists during this time period are competing for votes. And in the complex New York State political system, they're making votes. And let me read to you from a poem that appeared in 1812. It was published by Alden Spooner, a Brooklyn Republican, in his newspaper. And it summed up voting in New York. By the big book of rules, which our lawyers wrote, no man unassessed is permitted to vote. Yet, said one to the neighbor, in these party days, they will vote, though unable 1 shilling to raise. You mistake, said the other, in grog shops and stores and Brooklyn hotels, they have raised many scores. So this was another aspect of the issue of voting in New York. And let me end with this paragraph. Foreign policy issues with direct local impact. The embargo and War of 1812 mobilized voters. Voter turnout went up because of the competition between the political parties. Any lingering commitment to deference vanished as Republicans and Federalists mobilized, praised, and competed for popular support. Both parties ignored the state election laws to maximize their support. Because of the intense need to mobilize voters, county and town committees used foreign policy issues to reach the electorate and persuade them to vote. Foreign policy provided an overriding issue, especially between 1808 and 1815, which allowed the Federalists to make a political comeback and encouraged them to mobilize the electorate. By 1816, Republicans reasserted their dominance in New York politics as the legacy of the War of 1812 faded. I'll end there.
Thank you, Professor Strum, for that fascinating paper. Again, I'm left with more questions, but I've been taking notes, so we'll have plenty to talk about at the end here. Our next paper will come from Sam Goodson and Christopher Putney. Christopher Putney and Sam Goodson both come to us from the CUNY Graduate Center, where Sam is a current doctoral student in comparative politics and political theory. Christopher currently works as a policy fellow for a member of Congress. Sam's interests are in Pan-African, Latin American, and French politics, as well as left movements, political economy, and continental philosophy. Christopher's interests are in American political development, especially the intersection of race, liberalism and its dilemmas, and constitutional theory. Their paper is titled The People's Party in American Political Development, Rethinking Populism and Democracy in the American South. Gentlemen, whenever you're ready.
Hello, everybody. Glad to be here. Chris, I think, is having a little technical difficulty. Oh, looks like he's back now. So
Yeah,
I'm going to
sorry,
get us going.
I'm good. Okay.
Great. All right. So I'm going to get us going with, so we are writing about the experience of the American People's Party in the 1890s. I'm going to get us started with a little of the literature that we're trying to intervene into, and I'm going to kick it over to Christopher, who's going to talk in a little more specificity about the experience of American populism. So the area that we were trying to leverage this case to speak to is towards the contemporary literature on democratic backsliding. Specifically on the literature on democratic backsliding that would hold populists around the world as being the primary trigger of democratic deconsolidation, to quote Yasha Monk, one of the more prominent writers in the school. So while it's obviously very broad and mixed, and some of it is much better than the rest, the kind of central theme of this contemporary literature is that whereas we used to could study nations becoming democracies and understand how that happened, once you got to democratization, especially if you're a wealthy country, that it was pretty much set, and that we didn't need to worry about that changing. And then again, as the argument goes, now after the election in 2016 or Brexit or the rise of Marine Le Pen or Hugo Chavez, or the list goes on, we now have to worry about what happens if democracies move backwards. And as I mentioned, these, in at least a subsection of this literature, populist candidates, populist leaders are framed as kind of the villains in this story via different ways, but that tends to be the central theme. So we wanted to look at this and kind of historicize this worry about populism. And so rather than getting into kind of what can be a tiring tit for tat argument about what is populism, what's good populism, what's bad populism, we rather wanted to look at the continuity between this contemporary worry about populism, how that relates to older scholarship on the role of ordinary people and the functioning of a democracy, and then try and pull out some kind of implicit definitions of what democracy is, where it comes from, and how it's stabilized, that we think go through from this older literature to the current anti-populist literature, making it a little less contemporary and time specific than it seems to be. And we think that the American People's Party ends up being a very good case study to do this, because we see that while it does fit the description that a lot of these writers would give to a populist party, it also is much more robustly democratic, liberal in certain important ways, not the kind of majoritarian direct democracy that is often associated with populism. So we look at a few authors. I think today, for the interest of time, we're going to stick to, or I'll stick to talking about Daniel Ziblatt's and Stephen Levitsky's 2018 How Democracies Die, both because it was, I think, very widely received outside of comparative politics, and because I think they talk in depth about the 19th century, so it gives a good opening for us to bring the experience of the People's Party to their conceptions of American political development in that period. So they, as described above, see the threat to modern democracy as coming from what they call would-be autocrats, which tend to be populists, who manage to, via the democratic institutions, find their way to the executive power, and then via their newfound power, use that to kind of disarm and break down democratic safeguards, pushing the polity that they're in charge of towards authoritarianism. They give a four-part definition of what these leaders are, four characteristics of these leaders. They reject the rules of the game, they deny the legitimacy of opponents, they tolerate or encourage violence, and they indicate a willingness to curtail the civil liberties of opponents. So those are the four aspects they say characterize these populist leaders. It's worth noting, Chris will get into more of this later, it's worth noting that those do not apply to leaders of the American People's Party. But anyway, that's what they're after. So the question becomes, of course, how is it that these would-be autocrats wind up in charge of these supposedly democratic countries? And the answer that they want to give is that it's the decline of gatekeeping institutions and an erosion of democratic norms. So for example, they cite the opening of American party primaries in the 1970s, the kind of decline of the smoke-filled room as a way in which these leaders are able to come into significant political power. Whereas before, of course, party leadership could pick who is going to be on the ticket. Now the masses are more involved in this process, and the would-be autocrats are able to kind of capitulate on popular anger to ride that to electoral success. They acknowledge, of course, that it's a fairly anti-democratic process to be the old smoke-filled room. They acknowledge the inherently anti-democratic nature of it, and they claim not to be nostalgic for it, but nonetheless, they seem to be saying that there's something to this process of taking the nominating process a few steps away from the population that allows to fend off people like Donald Trump and Marine Le Pen and whatnot. They also are concerned, alongside the declining gatekeeping institutions, about the decline in democratic norms, what they call tolerance and forbearance. So the willingness to work within, play by the rules of the game, to tolerate opponents, to understand that losses are temporary, to allow the system to continue to function. And that, I think it's worth dwelling on, where they see those norms as having been created, because it's in the 19th century, around the time or before the People's Party, before the populist moment, that they see as the creation of these norms. So it's with the consolidation of the first party system and Martin Van Buren that they see these norms as having been consolidated. And then, of course, right. So they think that with the birth of the American party system in the mid-19th century, or the consolidation of a certain party system, that these norms of tolerance and forbearance are created. They move along fairly well until the Civil War, in which point the system broke down. Obviously, the Southern slave-holding class began to see abolition as a fundamental threat to what they deemed, their form of government, their way of life. So they went to war, and that in the story is what broke it. And then, interestingly, they say it maintained broken. These norms were not functioning through Reconstruction, but then they locate the restoration of American democratic norms with the Compromise of 1877, right? So when the Southern elite comes to terms with the Northern industrial elite, brokers the Compromise of 1877, effectively ending Reconstruction on the South terms, abandoning the cause of Black enfranchisement in the South, abandoning the newly freed people to the capricious will of Southern governors and state legislatures. That is where they locate the rebirth of democratic norms. It's interesting for our work because, as C. Van Woodward and other Southern historians have noted, it's precisely against this compromise that the People's Party are trying to act. They're working against this kind of elite brokerage compromise. It's also, of course, interesting that they see this moment in which the entire Black population in the South is essentially forsaken to decades of Jim Crow as a moment in which democratic norms are restored. They also, it's interesting as well because they see our current moment of norm breaking as having begun in the post-civil rights movement era. So once again, they think that because that Republicans see racial politics as some kind of threat, that they're no longer willing to play by the game. So it's in both cases areas in which, well, let me just read, I'll quote them. So this is in reference to the Compromise of 1877. Paradoxically then, they write, the norms that would later serve as a foundation for American democracy emerged out of a profoundly undemocratic arrangement, racial exclusion and the consolidation of single party rule in the South. So, of course, they admit it's paradoxical. They're not unfamiliar with the consequences of the Compromise of 1877, and yet they're still willing to locate this as the birth of these important democratic norms, which I think Christopher and I argue is not actually paradoxical as they claim it to be. It fits precisely with a definition of democracy and democratization that is brokered by elite compromise, that is overly institutional, that sees the kind of stable functioning of elite-led institutions as the guarantor of democratic governance, rather than the participation of the polity, and in fact needs to be shielded, as in the nominating process, from the kind of irrational will of the masses. And we think this, that idea of populism, that idea of institutionalized democracy as such, is not unique to this current period of worry over populism, but rather has a long, very long history of worrying about democracy being too fragile for the polity to handle. And so we, Nancy Bermeo's work in particular, we look at her 2003 book, Ordinary People in Extraordinary Times. It seeks to trace the legacy of concern about civil society and ordinary people in the work of a lot of prominent political science work. So yeah, so then, yeah, so we're trying to take the experience of the People's Party, of the American populist experience, and have it speak back to this. Again, this is what I've cited today is only one example of a much broader literature, but we're trying to look at what the experience of the People's Party can tell to these conceptions of democratic governance. So I'll kick it over to Christopher now, who will tell us more about the People's Party.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief here. Can you hear me okay, by the way? Just give me a thumbs. All right, great. I was having some technical issues. So yeah, it's great to be with y'all. Thanks for having us. I guess like just to sort of pick it up where Sam left off, for those of y'all who aren't steeped in the contemporary debates about democratic backsliding and norm erosion, I mean, to be quite to state the obvious, the elephant in the room is the former president of the United States, and some of these allegedly parallel movements and figures, sort of hard far right, whatever would-be authoritarians, blah, blah, blah. And that's not, by the way, to downplay the seriousness or the severity of the abuse of power or real forms of like authoritarian impulses that we see around the world and in very recent history here in the United States. It's just to say, and I think Sam, framed this adequately, but just to underscore it, we are trying to take issue with what we see to be a larger failure, really, of leading academics, especially in comparative politics and American political development, as well as plenty of historians and journalists, frankly, to complicate or interrogate underlying assumptions about modern democracy. So obviously, this isn't an extended discussion of by democratic theorists, but we're trying to deal with historical material here. But what Sam indicated, and what I just want to drive home about the case selection, so to speak, for the People's Party is that this is a remarkable period, I think, by any measure, right? The sort of post-Reconstruction, we're looking into the late 1870s through the 1880s, and especially in the early 1890s with the kind of like consolidation of the People's Party as a literal and powerful, briefly, third party movement in the United States. This is a remarkable period in the polity's history, and we want to use this not because it's a kind of typical case of a democratic movement that really has material effects in national electoral politics, but to say, what is the rise of the populist party in that period of time, a pretty radical egalitarian movement? What does that imply or suggest about rethinking modern conceptions of democracy? So, in other words, when it's like the key thing here is the historical context, and we're not trying to say, in a kind of like romantic, easy nostalgia. Hey, let's look back to the farmers' uprising in 1890, and we can all sort of hold hands, sing kumbaya, and transform American democracy. That's not what the point is. The point is to say, leading scholars in this space who talk about democratic backsliding and who rightly worry about the rise of authoritarian right-wing movements across the globe, like they are sort of like recycling stale and frankly erroneous ahistorical conceptions of democracy that we just want to complicate. And the People's Party, for some of the reasons that Sam mentioned, are exactly a good case to do that. And this paper, by the way, is it's very, for a host of reasons, it's little more than an outline, unfortunately. But we want to, the bigger project, the bigger motive here is to return to that period, especially from, I'd say, 1877 through 1892 or 1893, to key parts of the rural South that have gotten overlooked and ignored. Everybody's used to talking about Kansas and the West and different the kind of birthplace, so to speak, of a lot of pockets of populist agitation in that period. But we actually find it, and I'll kind of say this and be quiet because I'm sure we need to move on, but we find the case equally remarkable, given that there are these pockets of radicalism and rural revolt, not just in the Upper South and in some of those sub-regions, but in the hill country down in Texas, in parts of North Georgia, parts of Alabama. There are basically key counties where we see explicit rejection of the race class categories that beset the South as a region, as a group of political formations that made up the former Confederacy. So we're trying to, we aside from just trying to complicate the question of democracy and populism, we're actually saying, people have overlooked how remarkable it is that that there were actual discernible periods of gestation and political development, movement development, and organization in the story of the Populist Party's rise across these parts of the South. I'm talking about explicit racial egalitarianism. I'm talking about very radical, retooling of parts of the American political intellectual tradition, right? So liberal pieces, revolutionary economic forms of dissent. In other words, the People's Party shows us the kind of reforging of like core political and economic arguments and forms of mobilization and self-awareness. And it's just it's interesting for many reasons, but we basically want to say, look, it's intellectually lazy and historically erroneous to talk about the rise of right-wing populism, so that we have, the leader, the guy, I'm just thinking of like the leader in the Philippines, for instance, or a figure like Donald Trump. But then, hey, guess what? What about Senator Sanders? He's a socialist. It's just so far. Like we just think this is an absolutely, we might as well just read a kind of Bret Stephens column in the New York Times and pretend that it's, it tells us anything we need to know about democracy or American politics at the level that I think scholars are supposed to do. So that's what we hope the People's Party case study does. And there's a lot more to it, so maybe we'll get into it in question and answer, but I'll kind of leave it from there. But that's the project. So anyway, good to be with you guys.
Gentlemen, thank you for that very interesting and very relevant paper. I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about in Q&A. And moving on to our final paper, which comes to us from Professor Philip Grant. Professor Grant earned his PhD at Georgetown University. He is currently a professor of history at Pace University, and his primary research interest is the history of Congress. Professor Grant's paper is titled Congressional Committee Chairman from New York, 2001 to 2020. Professor Grant, whenever you're ready.
Professor Grant, you'll need to unmute yourself. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Okay. Can I start over again now?
Yep,
May I begin?
you're coming through clear. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Between the opening ceremonies of the 107th Congress in January 2001 and the present time, 9 members of the House of Representatives from New York State have had the distinction of serving as chairman of standing committees. Reflecting the diversity of the New York congressional delegation, these individuals have included 4 women, 2 African Americans, and 1 Hispanic. Perhaps the most diverse congressional delegation in the entire country. Throughout the first 6 years of the 20th century, the Republican Party maintained numerical control over the House of Representatives. And one of the most prominent Republican incumbents was Peter T. King, who had served his political apprenticeship as Nassau County Controller. In 2005 and 2006, King was designated chairman of the Homeland Security Committee. This committee had been set up as a reaction to 9/11 and the passage of the Patriot Act a couple of years earlier. What happened in 2006? In 2006, Democrats attained majority status in the House Nancy Pelosi, of course, became Speaker. Over the ensuing 4 years, Democrats Adolphus Towne, Nydia Velazquez, Charles B. Rangel, and Louise M. Slaughter became committee chairman. So the Democrats had been out of power in the House for 12 years. Once they came back in, 4 New York Democrats were committee chairman. Let's take one at a time. Adolphus Townes. Adolphus Townes, for 3 decades, persevered as the spokesman of an impoverished African-American district in Brooklyn, probably the poorest district in the United States. Townes occupied the chairmanship of the Congressional Black Caucus, 1991 and 1992, and the Oversight and Government Reform Committee in 2009 and 2010. While heading the Oversight and Government Reform Panel, Townes exercised responsibility for monitoring both the operations and the expenditures of all federal departments, commissions, administrations, agencies, bureaus, and boards. Well, just as Congress creates these various executive units, Congress also has the responsibility of monitoring them. And this is especially true when their scandals arise, or at least circumstances point to scandals. So that was his responsibility, chairman of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. Next, Nydia Velazquez. Her background in public office included 1 term on the New York City Council and 3 years as director of the Department of Puerto Rican Community Affairs in the United States. Velazquez is currently in the midst of her 15th term, and she was chairman of the Small Business Committee 2009 and 2010. And as chairman of the Small Business Committee, he was especially concerned with barbershops and convenience stores and other small businesses in minority communities in ghetto areas, which had to a large extent been chronically neglected. Charles B. Rangel. Charles B. Rangel's 46-year congressional career paralleled the administrations of 8 presidents of the United States. Prior to entering the House in 1971, Rangel had completed 2 terms in the New York State Assembly. He was a very young man when he had entered the Assembly. He succeeded the legendary Adam Clayton Powell in the House of Representatives. Between 2010 and between 2007 and 2010, Rangel was the chairman of the powerful Ways and Means Committee, the first African-American ever to chair that committee. Rangel was instrumental in finalizing the provisions of the Affordable Care Bill of 2010, the Obamacare bill. And at the time of his retirement, Rangel was outranked in longevity by only 1 of his 434 House colleagues. So that was a long tenure, 46 years in the House of Representatives, culminating in the chairmanship of the Ways and Means Committee. Like Rangel, Louise M. Slaughter was a former member of the New York State Assembly. And Slaughter, from 1909 to 1910, chaired the Rules Committee. And while presiding over the Rules Committee, Slaughter dispatched a substantial number and wide variety of measures fulfilling the priorities of President Barack Obama and Speaker Nancy Pelosi to the House floor. So when bills were introduced, they were submitted to the Rules Committee, and it was up to Louise Slaughter to determine which of these bills were worthy of floor consideration. And of course, she was very sympathetic to both President Obama and Speaker Pelosi. So let's do a little reviewing. King, Towns, Velazquez, Wrangel, and Slaughter, emerging victorious in all 83 of their general election contests, ranked as accomplished political practitioners. And each of these individuals obviously was a beneficiary of the seniority system. King, one of the comparatively few Republicans within the ranks of New York congressmen, was a reliable conservative. On every issue of consequence, King was in accord with the partisan agenda of President George W. Bush and Speaker Dennis Hastert, a reliable, loyal, steadfast Republican in every respect. By contrast, Towns, Velazquez, Wrangel, and Slaughter were genuinely liberal Democrats and compiled virtually unblemished positive ratings by such organizations as the Americans for Democratic Action, ADA, and the AFL-CIO Committee on Political Education, COPE. So you had the contrast, King, a highly conservative Republican, and the others, Velazquez, Wrangel, Slaughter, and Towns, by every standard liberal Democrats. After 8 years of Republican domination of the House, the Democrats wrested control in 2018. And when the new Congress assembled in 2019, 4 New York Democrats, Carolyn Maloney, Eliot Engel, Nita Lowey, and Jerry Nadler, were elevated to committee chairmanships. So just as 4 had served between 2007 and 2010, 4 more were to serve in the Congress chosen in 2018. What can we say about these individuals? While differing somewhat in personalities, Maloney, Engel, Lowey, and Nadler were united in their firm commitments to oppose the policies of GOP President Donald J. Trump. No question about it. All 4 of these individuals were solidly against Trump on every question coming before the House. Let's take a look at Carolyn Maloney. Carolyn Maloney in 1993 advanced from the New York City Council to the House of Representatives. Re-elected by her constituents to 14 additional terms on Capitol Hill, Maloney in 2019 assumed the chairmanship of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, the same committee which previously had been chaired by Adolphus Towns. And in this capacity, she strongly objected to the manner in which President Trump administered the executive branch of the government, especially the Department of Education and the Department of Justice. She felt there were many abuses, there were many shortcomings, there were many problems, and she voiced objections in this capacity. How about Eliot Engel? Well, following 4 years in the New York State Assembly, Engel in 1988 won his first term in Congress. So he came in 1988 and he remained in 2020. In 2019 and 2020, Engel chaired the Foreign Affairs Committee and established himself as a harsh critic of the Trump administration's sympathetic attitudes toward both Russia and Saudi Arabia. He, as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, made no bones about it, his disenchantment with Trump's foreign policy. Nita Lowey. Nita Lowey's 32 years in the House corresponded with Engel's tenure. So they both served from different districts, of course, over a span of 32 years. Lowy was a member of the Appropriations Committee for 30 over 32 years, between 1919 and 2020. And during her final 2 years, she was the chairman of the committee, the first woman ever to become the chairman of the Appropriations Committee. In 2020, Lowy authored the 3 economic stimulus bills, having the objective of mitigating the sufferings of the pandemic and the unemployment crisis. So during the time that we had this national emergency, and we're still having it, of course, stimulation bills were considered absolutely necessary. And in each case, Nita Lowy authored the bill, which actually became law. Jerry Nadler. Jerry Nadler was an attorney by profession, and he has spent altogether 16 years in the New York State Assembly and 29 years in the House of Representatives. So Charlie Rangel was around for 46 years. Thus far, Jerry Nadler's been there in various capacities for 45 years. And over the past 3 years, Nadler has been chairman of the Judiciary Committee. And I think we're all familiar with the fact that Nadler exercised the task of authoring and serving as floor manager of the 2020 and 2021 resolutions, culminating in the impeachments of President Trump. So again, we've had relatively few impeachments in American history, and 3 of these, all involving Trump, have come during the time that Nadler has presided over the Judiciary Committee. What about the political successes of these individuals? Well, a review of the election statistics documented the fact that Carolyn Maloney, Elliot Engel, Nita Lowy, and Jerry Nadler had triumphed in their numerous general election contests by resounding margins. Not a single one of these 4 individuals had ever experienced defeat in the general election race. And their average electoral proportions have been as follows. For Maloney, 73.8%. For Engel, 69.9%. For Lowy, 68.7%. And for Nadler, 73.6%. So by whopping margins, these 4 individuals have been elected and re-elected time and time again. And as a consequence, have attained seniority and have become committee chairman. What about various other states in comparison with New York State? Well, between 2000 and 2021, New York has produced, as I said earlier, 9 committee chairmen, the highest number of any state in the union. And the numbers of committee chairmen from other major states have been far less. 5 for Texas, 5 for Michigan, 4 for Ohio, 3 for California, and 3 for Pennsylvania. So if you add up the sum total of these 9 committee chairmen, which I've briefly analyzed this afternoon, you'll find that they were able to win in their districts. They were able to stay in the House for long periods of time. And of course, did become committee chairmanships in some cases, such as Rangel and Lowy and Nadler, major committee chairmanships. Thank you very much, friends. I've enjoyed being part of this panel. I hope I didn't detract too much from its high quality. Thank you.
Not at all, Professor Grant. We really enjoyed your paper. Thank you so much. We have run over a little bit, which I guess is the one thing about our conference that's normal. So we'll have only limited time for Q&A. I have a lot of questions, but I think it'll be better for me to start by opening it up to you all, since you're the political scientists in the room. One of the things I did want to begin with was leadership seems to be a common theme that runs through our whole panel and all of your papers. I wanted to start by asking if you guys had thoughts on just the themes of leadership that undergird these this research and these ideas. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions on that note?
Well, I just to make one comment. None of these individuals attained leader positions in the House. Nancy Pelosi, of course, from California, Jim Clyburn from South Carolina, and Denny Hastert from Illinois, John Boehner from Ohio. But if you're talking about leadership within committees, they succeeded. They certainly didn't reach the pinnacle of the speakership or minority leadership.
Well, from my end, it's rather obvious. It's George Clinton, DeWitt Clinton, as leaders in New York politics in the late 18th and early 19th century. And of course, Martin Van Buren, whose leadership will end up becoming vice president and president of the United States. And Daniel Tompkins, who serves as multiple terms as governor of New York and ends his political career as vice president of the United States, following in the footsteps of essentially George Clinton, because another New York kind of position was vice president, because we ended up with Aaron Burr, George Clinton, and Daniel Tompkins during the early part of the 19th century. 3 New Yorkers as vice president, of course, and later is Martin Van Buren thrown into the mix as examples of leadership.
Excellent points. Yeah, thank you. What questions do you all have for each other?
Michael? Michael?
Michael, I think you might be muted. I'm sorry. There we go.
Can you hear me, Michael? Oh.
We can't hear you, Michael.
Can you hear me now?
I can.
No, I enjoyed all the presentations, and I was thinking of Sam and Chris's presentation. And my background is history, and you talking about populism, and I was thinking about the populist movement, right after Reconstruction. And I think it was Chris that mentioned there was pockets of equality in parts of the South. Because when I think about the populist movement, I think about separation and equality from a separatist perspective. We'll work together. But you mentioned pockets of egalitarianism that not really highlighted a lot in the literature. So I just wanted you to, if you could expand on that and talk about some of the examples. Chris or Sam?
Yeah, Chris. Well, yeah. I mean, it's been so great to hear from everybody, by the way, so far. And to be honest, I bet Sam's going to. I mean, Sam has done some really great empirical work digging into county totals, vote totals, and some key elections throughout these pockets and sub-regions in the South. So he can speak to some of the more granular stuff. But I'll just say, number one, I didn't mean to imply that there's a whole bunch of poor, whatever. I'm not going to, give a lecture to you guys on Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, and about how class and race, have this complex relationship in that key period. Of course they do. But I would just say first, I did not mean to, I don't think we're implying that, there were very poor, economically and geographically marginalized, sort of politically irrelevant, pauperized whites, as well as freed Blacks, poor Black farmers, and many of them, of course, were tenant farmers, during and especially after the war. I did not mean to imply that there was a pure kind of all-pervading racial egalitarianism. I guess what the interesting thing we found is that where it did exist, where real, sort of biracial, political, strategic, and sincere kind of like solidarity, racial solidarity, under the larger auspices of class organization and class power and emancipatory movements, like what can that tell us that's fundamental about this period in our politics and about democracy more generally? In other words, it really is there. I mean, you mentioned thinking about divisions. Of course, this isn't, no one should be faulted for not knowing this, but there was also some conspiratorial elements in the kind of populists, right? This is, I think, obvious. To be honest with you guys, I sort of think it has more to do with the anti-Masonic, anti-secret society elements in the country at the time. I think it's overstated, but I think our point is both that there was legitimate race, equality, solidarity ethos, a kind of pervading ethos in these key places, as well as just the strategic, pragmatic, you might say, coalitional motivations. And I guess my point is that that's interesting too, because it shows us that it is actually possible, right, to build multiracial, sort of class-based, larger political movements that are democratic, small d democratic in nature and motivation. And regardless of what it tells us about self-interest or about white domination and white supremacy, I think all of those cases are interesting. But Sam, I wonder, I need to shut up, but Sam, do you have a quick note on that, like how the racial component or the unity in these key places we're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, like Tom Watson famously, at the peak of his leadership of the populist movement, has some what sound like very racially progressive statements, right? He talks about the mutual self-interest of Black and white farmers, what sounds very progressive at the time, but then by 1910, 1912, he's degenerated to be worse than a lot of the worst white supremacists in the American South. And then Glenn Feldman's written a really good book called The Disenfranchisement Myth, about how a lot of these populists who, while they may have briefly been willing to work across racial lines, by 1900, he's focusing on Alabama. The Alabama Jim Crow Constitution was passed in 1901. So by 1901, a lot of these people that had formerly showed promise of a kind of racial alternative for the South are willing to vote to disenfranchise every Black person in Alabama, essentially. And so it's a really, so that being said, though, the populists for a time did, I think, pose maybe the only meaningful alternative to the consolidation of the one-party white supremacist state in the South. So it's just, so yeah, as I think you and Chris both said, like it was always self-interested, right? These weren't necessarily altruistic and egalitarian ideas that they were being put forward, but they understood a mutual self-interest. So perhaps, even though that maybe is not as equal and progressive as we want, I think there is something that I think Chris is getting at that's interesting about that for this brief moment, for these maybe 2-3 election cycles, there was the promise of some kind of coalition building, even beyond the bounds of the entrenched white supremacy in the South at the time. I think C. Vann Woodward in The Strange Career of Jim Crow has a line about, like, the wonder is not that they failed, but that, or that they didn't achieve any kind of more progressive agenda, but that in the face of the South in the 1890s, they were able to briefly kind of put together an alternative. So yeah, but of course, there's always, things, they went poorly, well, you know what I'm saying.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one or maybe two more short questions. Would anyone like to ask a question of your colleagues?
I had a question, but I was just talking, so I want to defer to anyone else who has one first here. Okay, we're gonna go for it then. Okay, I just wanted to ask, and I know this isn't precisely in the chronological time frame you had dealt with, Harvey, but I wondered if you could speak a little bit to, and again, this isn't so arcane and irrelevant, but it just, you piqued my interest and made me think back to some projects I had done several years ago on the history of US, like basically territorial policy in the Old Northwest. And I just realized, I wondered what role, if any, did ongoing territorial organization that kind of had its, I guess, I don't know, I think you could say, let's say from the passage of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 and some of those early state building, processes in the Old Northwest and other territories. Like, this was a fraught, from my understanding, was a fraught nexus of complicated foreign relations issues. And they had material effects for ongoing, that early period up through at least the War of 1812 with Britain, with Spain, with other people up in Canada and the Old Northwest. So anyway, I just wonder if, like, is that even sort of on the radar here? Yeah.
Essentially, there are 3 countries that the United States was concerned about, plus a 4th group, which wasn't a country as such, but was concerned throughout the period from the 1790s through the actual purchase of Louisiana in 1803. The concern is about access to the Mississippi River for Americans living west of the mountains, because one of the major changes is once the Revolution ends, Americans flock across the mountains and settle the area west on Tennessee, southeastern Ohio, Kentucky, and they need access to New Orleans to get their goods shipped to Europe or to the East Coast. There are no roads, there's no interstate, there's nothing. The second is the issue of the ongoing wars of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, which complicate our relationship. We end up in an undeclared war with France from 1798 to 1800. And then, of course, we end up with the War of 1812. And the issues out of that become dominant political issues. The issue of Spain doesn't really become a major political issue. It's sort of behind the scenes. But what becomes a dominant political issue is the question of our relations with France and Great Britain. And then the sort of ungroup is terrorists. The terrorists, we use the expression, the Barbary pirates. But we're talking about Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. And we fight 2 undeclared wars with them. We fight the famous war which gets from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli with what is now Libya. But we also find another undeclared war in 1816 with the Algerians over the same issue, whether the United States has to pay tribute to protect American sailors and American shipping in the Mediterranean and off essentially the area around the Straits of Gibraltar. And essentially that becomes a significant political and economic issue for Americans during this time period, because we want access to the Mediterranean and we can't get it because we no longer have the protection of the British Navy. And so, these are the foreign policy issues that dominate the period.
Interesting. Cool. Yeah. Thank you. That's very interesting.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but once again, I want to thank you all so much for participating. I've learned so much from your papers. It was really enjoyable. Thank you all again, and I will kick it back over to Dr. Cody.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And as the section chair of the History and Politics section, I want to thank Ashley Bozian for taking time to moderate this panel, to thank all of you gentlemen for sharing your research. And I only wish we had more time, but it's a Sunday afternoon and we should all take a little time to rest. So I want to thank everybody. I'll stop the recording now.